After a heart-wrenching custody battle, in which 12-year-old Julia bravely exposed her mother's abuse in court, her father, Jonathan Carter, thought the hardest part of their journey was behind them. But he would soon uncover that Karen's neglect had taken a devastating toll on Julia's leukemia treatment, and according to the doctors, it was already too late. Before we dive into part 2 of this gripping story, comment where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains of Julia Carter's new bedroom, casting a warm glow across her sleeping form. It was the second day she had woken up in her father's house, and the unfamiliarity of her surroundings still lingered in her mind as she drifted between sleep and wakefulness. A gentle hand on her shoulder roused her fully, and she opened her eyes to see her father, Jonathan Carter, sitting on the edge of her bed. His kind eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled down at her. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said softly. "Did you sleep well?" Julia nodded, returning his smile with a small one of her own. Despite the positive outcome of yesterday's hearing and the joy of being with her father again, a part of her still felt guarded, a habit formed from years of living with her mother's unpredictable moods. Jonathan's voice broke through her thoughts. "I was thinking we could try out a new school today," he said, his tone careful and gentle. "Just a trial to see how you like it. And then in the afternoon, we have an appointment with a new pediatric oncologist for a comprehensive checkup. I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to help you get better, especially after—" He trailed off, not wanting to explicitly mention her mother's neglect of her post-care treatments. Julia's expression clouded slightly at the mention of school and doctors. She had missed so much school due to her illness and her mother's negligence, and the thought of being the new kid, especially in her condition, made her stomach churn with anxiety. As for the doctor, while she knew it was necessary, the idea of more tests and treatments filled her with dread. Sensing her hesitation, Jonathan quickly added, "It's just a trial, sweetheart. Nothing is set in stone. We'll find a school where you feel comfortable, I promise." Julia nodded again, appreciating her father's reassurance. "Can I wear my wig to school?" she asked quietly, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the wig sitting on her bedside table. "Of course you can," Jonathan replied without hesitation. "Whatever makes you feel most comfortable." With that settled, Julia slowly got out of bed and made her way to the closet where her father had hung up her clothes. She selected a simple outfit, a pair of jeans and a loose-fitting sweater that would hide her thin frame. As she dressed, she couldn't help but compare this morning routine to the ones she had endured with her mother. There was no yelling, no harsh criticism of her appearance, just the quiet support of her father waiting patiently downstairs. When Julia came down to the kitchen, she found Jonathan busy at the stove, the smell of pancakes filling the air. He turned and smiled as she entered. "I made your favorite," he said, gesturing to the stack of blueberry pancakes on the counter. "I remember how much you used to love these on Saturday mornings." Julia felt a warmth spread through her chest at the memory. It had been so long since anyone had made her favorite breakfast. She sat down at the table, watching as her father brought over the plate of pancakes and a glass of orange juice. As they ate, Jonathan filled the silence with gentle conversation, telling Julia about Elton Elementary School, where they would be visiting that morning. He described the small class sizes, the art program, and the supportive staff, all the while assuring her that if she didn't feel comfortable there, they would keep looking until they found the right fit. Julia listened, picking at her pancakes. She managed a few bites, more to please her father than out of any real appetite. When she had eaten as much as she could, she looked up at Jonathan. "I'm ready," she said softly. Jonathan nodded, understanding in his eyes. He knew it would take time for Julia to adjust, to feel truly at home and comfortable, but he was determined to be patient, to give her all the time and support she needed. As they headed out to the car, Julia paused in the doorway, taking a deep breath. This was a new chapter in her life, filled with both hope and uncertainty. With her father by her side, she stepped out into the morning sunlight, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The drive to Elton Elementary School was quiet, the silence broken only by the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional directions from the GPS. Julia sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the passing scenery. As they drove, she began to feel a familiar dizziness creeping over her, a side effect of her condition that she had grown accustomed to hiding. Not wanting to worry her father, or potentially derail their plans for the day, Julia simply asked, "Dad, could you turn down the air conditioning a bit? It's a little cold." Jonathan glanced at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "Of course, sweetheart. Are you feeling okay?" Julia nodded, forcing a small smile. "I'm fine, just a little chilly." As they pulled into the school parking lot, the morning sun was high in the sky, its heat beating down on them as they stepped out of the car. Julia felt the dizziness intensify as the warm air hit her, but she gritted her teeth and followed her father towards the school building. They had only taken a few steps when Julia felt a sudden rush of warmth in her nose, followed by a familiar wetness. Before she could react, blood began to trickle down her face. The world around her began to spin, and she reached out blindly for her father. "Dad," she managed to whisper before her knees buckled beneath her. Jonathan turned just in time to see Julia collapse. With lightning-fast reflexes, he caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her limp form in his arms. "Julia, Julia, can you hear me?" he called out, his voice tight with panic. A security guard who had been patrolling the parking lot rushed over. "Sir, do you need me to call an ambulance?" he asked urgently. Jonathan shook his head, his mind racing. No, the hospital is nearby. I can get her there faster." Without waiting for a response, he scooped Julia up and hurried back to the car, his heart pounding in his chest. As he carefully placed Julia in the back seat, making sure she was secure, Jonathan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and self-recrimination. How had he not noticed she wasn't feeling well? He should have been more attentive, should have seen the signs. With trembling hands, he started the car and peeled out of the parking lot, his eyes constantly darting to the rear-view mirror to check on Julia. She remained unconscious, her face pale except for the bright red blood still trickling from her nose. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity, even though it took only a few minutes. Jonathan's knuckles were white on the steering wheel as he pulled up to the emergency entrance. He barely remembered to put the car in park before he was out and opening the back door, gently lifting Julia into his arms once more. "Help!" he called out as he burst through the emergency room doors. "My daughter needs help!" A nurse quickly approached, taking in the situation at a glance. "What happened?" she asked calmly as she gestured for a gurney to be brought over. Jonathan laid Julia gently on the gurney, his voice shaky as he explained, "She collapsed. Nosebleed. She has leukemia." The nurse nodded, her efficient movements belying the urgency of the situation. "We'll take care of her, sir. Please follow me." As they rushed Julia into the emergency unit, Jonathan found himself reciting her medical history to the doctor who had joined them. "Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Diagnosed 2 years ago. She's been in remission, but—" The doctor looked up sharply at this. "Has she been receiving her post-remission therapy?" Jonathan's face fell. I don't know. I just got custody of her yesterday. Her mother. She hasn't been taking proper care of her." The doctor's expression grew grave. "I see. How long has it been since her last treatment?" Jonathan racked his brain, trying to remember the details from the custody hearing. "I think about 3 months ago." The doctor exchanged a significant look with the nurse. "We need to run some tests immediately. It's possible her condition has worsened due to the lack of proper follow-up care." As the medical team worked to stabilize Julia and prepare her for tests, Jonathan stood by, feeling helpless and overwhelmed. He watched as they attached an IV, drew blood samples and checked her vital signs. The doctor turned to Jonathan, his voice serious but kind. "Mr. Carter, we need to run a comprehensive series of tests. We'll start with a complete blood count and blood smear test to check her blood cell levels. We'll also need to do CT scans to look for any enlarged lymph nodes, spleen or liver, which could indicate a progression of her ALL." Jonathan nodded, trying to process all the information. "How long will the results take?" "Normally we'd have the results tomorrow, but given the urgency of the situation—" "Please," Jonathan interrupted, "I'll pay whatever it takes to expedite the process. Money is no object when it comes to my daughter's health." The doctor nodded, understanding the father's desperation. "We'll do our best to get the results as quickly as possible. There's one more thing, Mr. Carter. Depending on what we find, we might need to perform a lumbar puncture to check for leukemic cells in Julia's cerebrospinal fluid. This would indicate if the cancer has spread to her central nervous system." Jonathan felt his heart sink at the possibility, but he nodded resolutely. "Whatever she needs, doctor, just please help her." As Julia was wheeled away for her tests, Jonathan found himself alone in the bustling emergency room, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He sank into a nearby chair, his head in his hands, praying silently for his daughter's recovery, and vowing to do whatever it took to make her well again. As Jonathan sat in the waiting room, his mind racing with worry for Julia, his phone began to vibrate in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing an unfamiliar number on the screen. For a moment he considered ignoring it, but something made him answer. "Hello," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Jonathan, it's Lisa Blake, Karen's younger sister." Jonathan straightened in his seat, surprised to hear from his ex-wife's sister. "Lisa, it's been a while." "I know," Lisa replied, her voice soft and tinged with regret. "I was at the hearing yesterday, but we didn't get a chance to talk. I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything Karen has done, for not stepping in sooner." Jonathan closed his eyes, memories of happier times with the Blake family flashing through his mind. "Lisa, you don't have to apologize for your sister's actions." "But I do," Lisa insisted. "I remember Julia when she was little. I've always loved her, but Karen, she wouldn't let me visit. I should have tried harder." Jonathan sighed, feeling the weight of the past few years. "It's not your fault, Lisa. Karen made her choices." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Lisa spoke again. "I was hoping, would it be all right if I came to see Julia? I'd love to reconnect with her." Jonathan hesitated, glancing towards the doors where they had taken Julia. "Actually, Lisa, we're at Elton Hospital right now. Julia fainted and had a nosebleed this morning. We're waiting for test results." "Oh my God," Lisa gasped. "Is she okay? Do you need anything? I can come to the hospital if you'd like some company." Jonathan felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. After years of dealing with Karen's hostility, Lisa's genuine concern was a welcome change. "That would be nice, actually. Thank you, Lisa." As he ended the call with Lisa, Jonathan noticed a missed call from his assistant, Morris. He quickly dialed back, realizing he had completely forgotten about work in the chaos of the morning. "Jonathan," Morris answered on the first ring. "I was wondering what time you'd be coming into the office today." "Morris, I'm sorry," Jonathan said, rubbing his forehead. "There's been a family emergency. I'm at the hospital with Julia. I won't be able to come in today." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that," Morris replied, his tone shifting from professional to concerned. "Is there anything I can do?" Jonathan was about to say no when he remembered the financial reports he had been waiting for. "Actually, Morris, could you email me that report detailing our recent investment losses and remaining debts? And has there been any change in the stock market today?" "I've already sent the report to your email," Morris confirmed. "As for the stock market, I'm afraid it's not good news. There's been a significant downturn today. Have you given any thought to our strategy moving forward?" Jonathan felt a headache building behind his eyes. The financial struggles of his company seemed trivial compared to Julia's health, but he knew he couldn't ignore them completely. "I'll review the report and get back to you on that, Morris. For now, just keep things running as smoothly as you can." After ending the call, Jonathan pulled out his tablet and opened his email. He began to review the financial report, trying to focus on the numbers and projections, but his mind kept drifting back to Julia. The stark reality of their situation was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Not only was Julia seriously ill, but the resources he had counted on to provide for her care were dwindling. Hours passed as Jonathan alternated between working on his tablet and pacing the waiting room. Finally, a doctor approached him, his expression serious. "Mr. Carter, Julia has been moved to room 532. If you'll come with me to my office, I'd like to discuss her test results with you." Jonathan felt his heart rate spike as he followed the doctor. They entered a small, sterile office, and the doctor gestured for Jonathan to take a seat. "Mr. Carter, I'm afraid the news isn't good," the doctor began, his voice gentle but direct. "Julia's condition has worsened significantly due to the lack of proper follow-up care. The leukemia has progressed, and we've found evidence that it has spread to her central nervous system." Jonathan felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. What does that mean for her treatment? For her prognosis? The doctor's expression grew grave. "Given the advanced state of her condition, the standard treatments are no longer viable. Without aggressive intervention, I'm afraid Julia may have less than a year left." Jonathan's world seemed to tilt on its axis. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in denial. "There has to be something we can do. What about alternative treatments?" The doctor nodded, pulling out a folder. "There are some experimental treatments that have shown promise in cases like Julia's. We would recommend a combination of advanced immunotherapy, specifically CAR T-cell therapy, and a bone marrow transplant. This approach offers a higher chance of survival. But what?" Jonathan pressed, desperate for any hope. "But it's extremely expensive," the doctor finished. "Most people aren't able to afford it without significant financial assistance." Jonathan swallowed hard, steeling himself for the answer to his next question. "How much are we talking about?" The doctor took a deep breath before responding. "The CAR T-cell therapy alone would cost between $350,000 to $500,000. The bone marrow transplant, including donor matching, surgery, recovery, and post-transplant care, would be in the range of $800,000 to $1.2 million. Jonathan felt the room spin around him. Even in his company's best days, these figures would have been staggering. Now, with his recent financial setbacks— "Mr. Carter," the doctor continued, his voice gentle, "if you decide to proceed with this treatment plan, the hospital would require an initial deposit of $200,000 to $300,000 in advance." Jonathan nodded numbly, his mind racing. He would find a way, he had to. "What about the bone marrow transplant? Could I be a donor?" The doctor shook his head. "I'm afraid not. Age is a significant factor in donor compatibility, and bone marrow donation can be physically demanding. Older individuals often have a higher risk of complications. Additionally, blood type is crucial. What's your blood type?" "I'm type A," Jonathan replied. "Julia is type O." "I'm sorry, but that makes you incompatible as a donor," the doctor confirmed. "We'll need to start a search for a suitable donor immediately." Jonathan nodded, trying to process all the information. I need to talk to Julia about this and reach out to family members about potential donors." The doctor stood, placing a comforting hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "Of course. Take some time to digest this information. Julia is in room 532 when you're ready to see her. We'll be monitoring her closely, and a nurse will be by soon to discuss the next steps in her care." As Jonathan left the doctor's office, he felt as if he were walking through a fog. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before him as he made his way to Julia's room, each step heavy with the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. Jonathan paused outside room 532, taking a deep breath to compose himself before entering. He didn't want Julia to see the fear and worry that he knew must be etched on his face. Pushing the door open gently, he stepped inside. Julia was awake, propped up slightly on the hospital bed. Her face was pale, making the dark circles under her eyes stand out even more starkly. But when she saw Jonathan, a small smile lifted the corners of her mouth. "Dad," she said softly, her voice weak but warm. Jonathan moved quickly to her side, taking her small hand in his. "Hey, sweetheart, how are you feeling?" Julia's brow furrowed slightly. "What happened? The last thing I remember is walking to the school." Jonathan squeezed her hand gently. "You fainted, honey. We brought you to the hospital." He paused, unsure how much to tell her. "Julia, I'm so sorry. I should have noticed you weren't feeling well." Julia shook her head, wincing slightly at the movement. "It's not your fault, Dad. I didn't want to worry you. I thought it would pass." Jonathan felt a lump form in his throat at her words. Even now, after everything she'd been through, Julia was trying to protect him. He took a deep breath, knowing he needed to have an honest conversation with her about her condition. "Julia, sweetheart, we need to talk about what the doctors found," he began gently. "It's not easy to take in, but I don't want to hide anything from you." "What is it, Dad?" she asked. "After everything that I've been through with Mum, I think I can take it." Jonathan's heart broke at her signs of courage. "You see, love, the doctor, he told me that your condition has gotten worse. The cancer, it's spread." Julia's eyes widened, fear flickering across her face before she quickly tried to mask it. "Oh," she said quietly. What does that mean?" Jonathan explained as gently as he could about the progression of her leukemia and the need for more aggressive treatment. He watched carefully as Julia processed the information, her young face showing a maturity beyond her years as she listened. "The doctors have recommended a new type of treatment," Jonathan continued. "It's called CAR T-cell therapy, and they think it could really help you. They also want to do a bone marrow transplant." Julia nodded slowly, her fingers picking at the edge of her blanket. "Will it hurt?" she asked in a small voice. Jonathan's heart clenched at the question. "I won't lie to you, sweetheart, it might be uncomfortable at times, but the doctors will do everything they can to make sure you're as comfortable as possible. And I'll be right here with you every step of the way." Julia was quiet for a moment, then looked up at her father with worried eyes. "Dad, can we afford it? I know these treatments must be expensive. Mom couldn't afford them." Jonathan was taken aback by the question. He hadn't expected Julia to be concerned about the financial aspect of her treatment. "Don't you worry about that, Julia. We'll figure it out." But Julia persisted, her voice trembling slightly. "But Mom always said you have a lot of money. That's why she said you would never have time for me because you were busy." Jonathan felt a surge of anger at Karen for burdening Julia with adult concerns and putting such a negative image of him, but he pushed it aside. Now wasn't the time for that. "Julia, listen to me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "It's true that I've been busy building the company. I started it from nothing, but you see, the company is having some financial difficulties lately. All the stress, missing you, fighting for custody, and some bad business decisions have hurt my finances. But I still have enough, and even if I didn't, I would find a way. You are my priority, always." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "But Dad, I don't want to waste your money. What if my condition turns out worse after the expensive treatment?" Jonathan felt his own eyes stinging as he pulled Julia into a gentle hug. "Sweetheart, listen to me. You could never be a waste of anything. Money can be earned again, but you're irreplaceable. I will use every last penny I have, take out loans, do whatever it takes to make sure you get the treatment you need." He looked her in the eyes. "Do you understand?" Julia nodded. "Thank you, Dad. I know you're not the person Mum described to me." As he held his daughter, Jonathan's mind raced with plans. He knew he would have to make some drastic changes to his work life to afford Julia's treatment and be there for her. But as he felt Julia's small arms wrap around him, he knew without a doubt that it would be worth it. "Dad?" Julia's voice was muffled against his chest. "Will you be here? For the treatment, I mean. I know you have to work." No. Jonathan pulled back slightly, looking into Julia's eyes. "I promise you, Julia, I will be here for every important moment. The day of your surgery, your treatments, everything. Work can wait. You are what matters most." As they sat together, Jonathan's phone buzzed with an email notification. He glanced at it, seeing Morris's name in the sender field. "Just a second, sweetheart," he said, reaching for his phone. The email contained a picture of a sealed envelope from the court. Morris's message read, "Jonathan, I think this is important. It looks like there's a new update from the police station. Should I bring it to the hospital?" Jonathan felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. What could this new development be? He quickly typed out a reply. "Yes, please bring it over. I also want to discuss something important with you." As he set his phone aside, Julia looked at him questioningly. "Is everything okay, Dad?" Jonathan nodded, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. My assistant is just bringing over some papers for me to look at." He didn't want to worry Julia with the possibility of more legal complications. While they waited for Morris to arrive, Jonathan started contacting his family and friends, searching for potential bone marrow donors. However, with each call, he felt a growing heaviness as he recognized how much his social circle had dwindled. The years he had spent prioritizing his business had created a distance, leaving him estranged from most of the people in his life and with few meaningful connections outside of work. And just as he was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the lack of potential donors, there was a knock at the door. Morris had arrived with the envelope from the police station. Morris entered the room quietly, his eyes widening slightly as he took in Julia's pale form on the hospital bed. He nodded a greeting to her before turning to Jonathan, who had opened the door for him. "Here are the envelopes, sir," he said, handing over 2 sealed documents. "Is there anything else you need?" Jonathan took the envelopes, feeling their weight in his hands. "Thank you, Morris. Could you wait outside for a moment? I'd like to discuss something with you after I've looked these over." As Morris stepped out, Jonathan turned his attention to the envelopes. He opened the first one, which contained an official document from the court detailing Karen's 2-year probation period, starting today. The second envelope, to his surprise, contained a letter from Karen herself. With a sense of trepidation, Jonathan began to read. "Jonathan, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to know how sorry I am for everything that's happened. I realize now how much I've hurt Julia, and I want to make things right. I'm committed to changing, to being the mother she deserves. I'm writing to request supervised visits with Julia, just a few days a week, to start rebuilding our relationship. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be better. Please, Jonathan. She's still my daughter, too." Jonathan felt a mix of emotions as he finished reading. Anger, disbelief, and a tiny flicker of pity. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, "This is just another manipulation." And Julia, who had been watching her father's face closely as he read, spoke up. "What is it, Dad? Is it about Mom?" Jonathan hesitated, uncertain about how much to reveal. Finally, he called Morris back into the room, and the man he had relied on for years stepped inside once more. "Mr. Carter, is everything all right?" Morris asked, noticing the tension in the room. Jonathan sighed and motioned for Morris to step closer. "I need your honest opinion," he said quietly. "Read this letter for me and tell me what you think. It's from Karen," he added, his voice tinged with unease. "She's asking for supervised visits with Julia." Morris's eyebrows arched in surprise. "Are you certain, sir? This seems like a deeply personal matter." Jonathan met Morris's gaze, his expression steady. "I trust you, Morris. We've been working together since before the company even existed," he said firmly. "I need an objective opinion, someone who knows me well enough to understand the situation, but isn't directly entangled in my family's issues. You've been by my side for years, and your perspective matters to me." Morris began reading the letter, his expression serious, shifting subtly as he absorbed each sentence. When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Jonathan. "After everything that's happened, do you really think she means it, sir?" Morris asked, skepticism clear in his tone. "Because I'd have my doubts. People don't just change overnight." "I doubt it," Jonathan replied, his voice firm as he echoed Morris's skepticism. "This is probably just another attempt to manipulate the situation. She's always been good at that." Julia, who had been straining to hear their conversation, spoke up again. "Dad, what did Mom say? Can I see the letter? Please, don't hide anything from me." Jonathan and Morris exchanged a glance, both unsure of how to proceed. Finally, Jonathan turned to Julia, his expression softening. "Sweetheart, your mother has written a letter apologizing for her actions. She says she wants to change and is asking for supervised visits with you." Julia's eyes widened, a mix of hope and fear crossing her face. "Really? Do you think she means it this time?" Jonathan felt his heart break a little at the hope in Julia's voice. He knew how desperately she wanted her mother's love and approval, despite everything that had happened. He chose his next words carefully. "Julia, I know you want to believe that your mother has changed, but we need to be cautious. She's hurt you many times before, and I don't want to see you get hurt again. Julia's lower lip trembled slightly. But what if she really is sorry this time? Maybe she just needs another chance. Jonathan sighed, moving to sit on the edge of Julia's bed. He took her small hand in his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. I understand how you feel, sweetheart, but we need to think about what's best for you right now. Your health and safety are the most important things. Julia nodded slowly, though Jonathan could see the conflict in her eyes. Can we at least let her know about my condition and treatment, even if she can't visit? Jonathan considered this for a moment. He didn't want to give Karen any opportunity to interfere with Julia's care, but he also didn't want to completely dismiss Julia's wishes. Finally, he nodded. All right, Julia, I'll meet with your mother first and have a talk with her. If I think she's genuinely changed and it won't cause you any stress, we can consider letting her know about your treatment. But I need you to trust me on this, okay? If I don't think it's a good idea, we'll have to wait. Julia nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I trust you, Dad. Jonathan leaned in and placed a gentle kiss on Julia's forehead. Thank you, sweetheart. Now, why don't you try to get some rest? I need to talk to Morris about some work things, but I'll be right outside if you need me. As Julia settled back against her pillows, Jonathan turned to Morris. Let's step outside for a moment. There are some things we need to discuss. Once in the hallway, Jonathan closed the door to Julia's room softly behind him. He turned to Morris, his expression grave. Morris, I need you to do something for me, he began. I want you to create an open donation request flyer and social media post, asking our employees to circulate it in their circles. We're looking for potential bone marrow donors for Julia. Morris nodded, already pulling out his tablet to make notes. Of course, sir. I'll get on that right away. Is there anything else? Jonathan hesitated for a moment before continuing, his voice low but resolute. Yes, actually. I need you to start preparing for some significant changes at the company. I'm going to have to step back from my day-to-day responsibilities for a while to focus on Julia's care. I'm aware of our recent financial struggles, but... He paused, taking a deep breath. But if the universe has blessed me with this company, I believe it should be for my daughter's treatment. That's just how much I owe her for all these years. You know what I mean? Morris's eyes widened slightly, but he nodded in understanding. We'll make it work, sir. Julia's health comes first. Is there anything else you need from me right now? Jonathan shook his head. No, that's all for now. Thank you, Morris. I appreciate your support during this difficult time. As Jonathan finished discussing the situation with Morris, he glanced back at Julia's sleeping form. A wave of protective love washed over him, but he knew what he had to do next. Morris, Jonathan said, his voice low, I have one last favor to ask. I know you're busy with all those pending tasks I've given you, but could you stay here with Julia for a while? I need to go see Karen. Morris nodded without hesitation. Of course, sir. I can work from here while Julia is sleeping. Her well-being comes first. Jonathan clasped Morris's shoulder gratefully. Thank you. I promise I won't be long. I'll return to the hospital as soon as I can. With one last look at his sleeping daughter, Jonathan left the room and made his way through the hospital corridors. The weight of what he was about to do pressed heavily on his shoulders as he stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. In the parking lot, Jonathan climbed into his car and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He pulled out his phone and dialed Karen's number, his heart racing as he waited for her to pick up. Hello? Karen's voice came through, a mixture of surprise and hope evident in her tone. Karen, it's Jonathan, he said, keeping his voice neutral. I've read your letter. We need to talk. Jonathan, Karen exclaimed, her excitement palpable. Thank you for calling. I'm so glad you want to talk. There's a new cafe that just opened downtown, or we could meet at your place if you prefer. No, Jonathan cut in firmly. I'm coming to your house, our old house. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Karen spoke again, the disappointment was clear in her voice. Oh, all right. When should I expect you? I'm on my way now, Jonathan replied. I'll be there in about 20 minutes. After ending the call, Jonathan started the car and began the familiar drive to his old home. As he navigated the streets, memories of happier times rushed back, amplifying the weight of his current situation. He steeled himself, knowing the place he was headed once held the warmth of family, but now felt distant and foreign. Jonathan pulled up in front of the house that had once been his home, his heart heavy with a mix of nostalgia and apprehension. The once pristine exterior was now shabby and neglected, paint peeling and gutters sagging. It was a stark visual representation of how much had changed since he'd last lived here. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the car and walked up the cracked pathway to the front door. He hesitated for a moment before ringing the doorbell, steeling himself for the conversation ahead. Karen opened the door, and Jonathan was struck by how different she looked from the woman he had married. Her once vibrant appearance was now dulled, her eyes lacking the spark he remembered. She attempted a smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Jonathan," she said, her voice a mixture of nervousness and forced cheerfulness. "Come in." As he stepped inside, Jonathan was hit by a wave of memories. This entrance was where they had brought Julia home as a newborn, where they had taken countless family photos, where they had shared so many moments both joyous and mundane. But now, like the exterior, the inside of the house was a shadow of its former self. Empty bottles littered the surfaces, and the air was heavy with the stale smell of alcohol. The once immaculate home was now dirty and unkempt, a physical manifestation of Karen's decline. Karen seemed to notice his gaze taking in the state of the house. She quickly moved to clear some of the bottles from the coffee table, her movements jerky and nervous. I just haven't had time to clean up," she said, a defensive note in her voice. "You know, after coming back from the police station." Jonathan nodded silently, though his skepticism was evident as he moved further into the living room. He ran his hand along the back of the sofa, the same sofa where they used to cuddle with Julia during movie nights. Now it was stained and carried the faint, unpleasant smell of spilled alcohol. "Karen," he said, turning to face his ex-wife, "we need to talk about Julia." Karen nodded, sinking onto the sofa. "Yes, of course. How is she? Is she excited about coming to visit?" Jonathan's jaw tightened at Karen's assumption. He took a seat in the armchair across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Karen, Julia is in the hospital. Her cancer has worsened significantly due to lack of proper care." Karen's face paled, her eyes widening in shock. "Really? But I thought she was doing better. She was in remission the last time I took her for chemotherapy." "Remission doesn't mean cured, Karen," Jonathan said, struggling to keep the anger out of his voice. "She needed ongoing treatment and care, which she didn't receive under your custody." Karen looked away, a flicker of guilt, fear and disdain crossing her face. I didn't know," she murmured, her voice strained. "I thought she was fine." Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. "Julia needs a bone marrow transplant, Karen. It's very expensive, and we're struggling to find a donor." Karen's eyes widened. "Expensive, but surely you can afford it, Jonathan. Your company is doing well, isn't it?" Jonathan chose his words carefully, not wanting to reveal the full extent of his financial difficulties. "The treatment is more expensive than you might think, Karen, but that's not the point. We need to find a donor, and quickly." A heavy silence settled between them, thick with unspoken words and regrets. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice tentative. "So, you want me to help her? Is that why you're here? To beg me when just yesterday in court you were doing everything you could to defeat me?" Jonathan looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since entering the house, and in that moment he realized he no longer saw any traces of the woman he had once loved, the mother of his child. "I'm not here to beg, Karen," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "You were her mother as much as I am her father. Your letter mentioned an apology and another chance to rebuild the relationship, so I was hoping you might be willing to help her. Would you be willing to be tested as a potential donor? You're Julia's closest biological match." Karen's expression shifted at the mention of the letter, a blend of fear, uncertainty, and something else Jonathan couldn't quite decipher flashing across her face. "Ah, yes, the letter," she said, her voice distant. She paused for a long moment before finally nodding. "Okay," she murmured softly. "Sure, I'll do it. Anything to help Julia understand how much she matters to me. Jonathan felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly extinguished by Karen's next words. So, what's in it for me if I volunteer to be a donor? The words hung in the air between them, heavy and ugly. Jonathan felt a deep sense of disgust and regret wash over him. Even now, even when Julia's life was at stake, Karen was looking for personal gain. For a moment, Jonathan considered walking out, ending this charade once and for all. But the image of Julia in her hospital bed, pale and weak, flashed through his mind. He knew he had to swallow his pride for her sake. Without a word, Jonathan reached into his pocket and pulled out his checkbook. With a steady hand, he wrote out a check for $10,000 and held it out to Karen. "Here's the deal," Jonathan said, his voice low and measured. "Take this check and think about your daughter, Julia. If you still love her, even a little bit, please go through with the compatibility check. If you're a match, then the transplant is your opportunity to prove your commitment to her. But after that, you stay out of our lives until you're seriously sober, have a proper job, and have sought treatment for your alcohol addiction. Use this money for your recovery and rebuild your life. Those are my terms." Karen's eyes locked onto the check, her hand reaching out almost involuntarily to take it. "Deal," she said quickly, not even looking at Jonathan as she clutched the check. "I'll come to the hospital later. My sister Lisa is coming over soon." Jonathan remembered his conversation with Lisa earlier that day. "Lisa called me this morning. She said she was planning to go to the hospital to meet with Julia." Karen waved her hand dismissively, her attention still on the check. Sure, I'll go with Lisa then." Jonathan stood up, a feeling of weariness settling over him. He walked towards the door, not bothering to say goodbye. Karen didn't seem to notice or care, her eyes still fixed on the check in her hand. As he stepped out into the afternoon sun, Jonathan felt a mix of emotions: disgust at Karen's behavior, sadness for what their family had become, and a glimmer of hope that, despite everything, they might have found a way to help Julia. He got into his car and sat there for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The house he had just left, once a home filled with love and laughter, now felt like a tomb of broken dreams and shattered promises. With a heavy sigh, he started the engine and began the drive back to the hospital, his mind already turning to the next steps in Julia's treatment. When Jonathan returned to the hospital, he found Morris sitting in a chair next to Julia's bed, reading aloud from a book. Julia was awake, a small smile on her face as she listened to the story. The scene warmed Jonathan's heart, reminding him that even in the midst of this difficult situation, there were still moments of simple joy. As Jonathan entered the room, both Morris and Julia looked up. Morris closed the book and stood, nodding respectfully to Jonathan. "Thank you for staying with her, Morris," Jonathan said gratefully. "It was my pleasure, sir," Morris replied. "Julia is an excellent listener." Julia's smile widened slightly at the compliment, but her eyes were fixed on her father, clearly eager to hear about his meeting with her mother. As Morris excused himself to return to the office, Jonathan took the seat by Julia's bed. He reached out and took her small hand in his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "How did it go with Mum?" Julia asked, her voice a mix of hope and apprehension. Jonathan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Your mother has agreed to come to the hospital and be tested as a potential donor," he said, watching Julia's face light up with hope. "She said she's willing to help with the transplant if she's a match." Julia's eyes widened. "Really? She'd do that? She's going to help?" Jonathan nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Yes, but Julia, I want you to understand something. Your mother, she's still struggling with her problems. She agreed to help, but she also asked for something in return, and I don't want you to raise your hope too much." Julia's face fell slightly. "Oh," she said softly. "What did she want?" Jonathan sighed. "She asked for something in return, sweetheart. I gave her a check, but only on the condition that after the transplant, if she's a match, she'll stay away until she's gotten help for her problems." Julia was quiet for a moment, processing this information. When she spoke again, her voice was small and sad. "She wouldn't help me unless you paid her." Jonathan's heart broke at the pain in his daughter's voice. He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm so sorry, Julia. I know this is hard to hear. Your mother, she's sick in her own way. She needs help, just like you need help for your leukemia." Julia nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know," she whispered. I hoped she'd want to help me because she loves me. Now I don't think I want her help anymore." Jonathan leaned in and wrapped his arms around Julia, careful of the IV lines and monitors. "Oh, sweetheart," he murmured, stroking her back gently. "You are so loved. Maybe not in the way you deserve from your mother right now, but you are loved so very much." As Julia cried softly into her father's shoulder, Jonathan held her, his own eyes stinging with unshed tears. After a few minutes, Julia pulled back, wiping her eyes. "When is Mum coming to the hospital?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Jonathan hesitated. "She said she would come later, possibly with your Aunt Lisa. But Julia, I don't want you to get your hopes up too much. We don't know for sure if she'll follow through." Julia nodded, a look of understanding beyond her years crossing her face. "I know," she said softly. "I won't expect too much." Jonathan felt a surge of pride at his daughter's maturity and resilience. He smiled at her, trying to lighten the mood. "Now, how about we see what's on TV? I think there might be a movie playing." Julia nodded, settling back against her pillows as Jonathan reached for the remote. He flipped through the channels until he found a familiar sci-fi movie playing. "Oh, look," he said. "It's Interstellar. Do you remember watching this with me when you were younger?" Julia's face lit up with recognition. "Yes, I remember. I didn't understand most of it, but I loved the space scenes." As they settled in to watch the movie, a nurse came in with Julia's lunch tray. Jonathan helped Julia sit up and arranged the tray in front of her. As the movie played in the background, he assisted her with eating, reminiscing about times when she was younger. "You know," he said, a smile playing on his lips, "when you were about 2 years old, you went through a phase where you refused to eat unless I pretended your teddy bear was the one feeding you." Julia giggled softly, the sound music to Jonathan's ears. "Really? I don't remember that." Jonathan nodded, his eyes twinkling with the memory. "Oh yes, I had to do all sorts of silly voices. Your mother thought I was crazy and unnecessary, but it always worked." As they shared this moment of normalcy amidst the sterile hospital environment, there was a soft knock at the door. Jonathan looked up to see Lisa standing there, a bouquet of flowers in one hand and a basket of fruit in the other. "Hey, is this a good time?" Lisa asked softly, her eyes moving from Jonathan to Julia. "Lisa!" Jonathan nodded, standing to greet her. "Of course, come in. Julia, look who's here to see you." Julia's eyes widened in surprise and a hint of happiness as she recognized her aunt. "Aunt Lisa," she said, her voice a mix of confusion and joy. Lisa stepped into the room, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Hello, Julia," she said softly. "It's so good to see you." As Lisa approached the bed, Jonathan couldn't help but notice that Karen was nowhere to be seen. He exchanged a knowing look with Lisa, both of them aware of what Karen's absence likely meant. But for now, they pushed that thought aside, focusing instead on the reunion between aunt and niece, determined to make this moment as positive as possible for Julia. Lisa approached Julia's bedside, her eyes soft with a mixture of joy and concern. She set the flowers and fruit basket on the nearby table before turning her full attention to her niece. "Oh, Julia," she said, her voice warm, "you've grown so much. You look just like your father. And your wig, they are beautiful." Julia blushed slightly at the compliment, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Thank you, Aunt Lisa," she said softly. "It's been a long time." Lisa nodded, a flicker of regret passing over her face. "Too long," she agreed. "I've missed you so much." As Lisa settled into the chair next to Julia's bed, Jonathan moved to the couch on the other side of the room, giving them some space to reconnect while still remaining present. He watched the interaction between aunt and niece with a mixture of gratitude and hope. Inside the room, Lisa and Julia were rekindling their relationship, reminiscing about happier times. "Do you remember when we used to have movie nights in the living room?" Lisa asked, her eyes twinkling. "You always insisted on building a blanket fort first." Julia's face lit up with the memory. "Yes, and you would make the best popcorn. Mom never made it quite the same way." As they talked, Lisa couldn't help but notice the changes in Julia. The vibrant, energetic child she remembered had been replaced by this pale, thin girl in a hospital bed. Yet, there was still a spark in Julia's eyes, a resilience that shone through despite everything she had been through. After a while, Lisa's expression grew more serious. "Julia, honey," she said gently, "your dad told me about your condition. I'm so sorry you're going through this." Julia's smile faded slightly, but she nodded bravely. "It's okay, Aunt Lisa. Dad says the doctors are going to try a new treatment." Lisa reached out and took Julia's hand in hers. "That's right, and I want you to know that I'm here for you, whatever you need." Julia's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" "Absolutely," Lisa affirmed with confidence. "In fact, I've already told your dad that I'm willing to be tested as a potential donor for your bone marrow transplant." Jonathan lifted his head from the couch at the mention of Lisa's offer, his eyes widening in disbelief. "No, you haven't," he exclaimed, a smile spreading across his face as he moved toward her. Lisa chuckled at their surprised expressions. She took a deep breath before continuing. "I want to be tested as a potential donor for your bone marrow transplant." Julia's face lit up with surprise and hope, while Jonathan's eyebrows shot up in astonishment. Neither of them had expected this offer. "You would do that for me?" Julia asked, her voice filled with emotion. Lisa nodded, squeezing Julia's hand gently. "Of course I would, sweetheart. You're my niece, and I love you. I should have been here for you more over the past few years. I'm sorry I wasn't, but I promise I'm here now." Tears welled up in Julia's eyes, and she lunged forward to hug her aunt, careful of her IV lines. Lisa held her close, stroking her back gently. Jonathan, now standing next to Lisa, felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He hadn't dared hope for such a generous offer, and the relief it brought was overwhelming. He moved closer to the bed, his voice thick with gratitude when he spoke. "Lisa, I don't know what to say. Thank you doesn't seem enough." Lisa looked up at him over Julia's shoulder, her own eyes glistening with tears. "You don't need to say anything, Jonathan. This is what family does. I just wish I had been here sooner." As Julia and Lisa separated from their embrace, both wiping their eyes but smiling, a nurse entered the room. She paused, sensing the emotional atmosphere. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. Jonathan nodded, a smile breaking across his face. "Yes, everything's fine. In fact, my sister-in-law here has just volunteered to be tested as a potential donor for Julia." The nurse's face lit up with a warm smile. "That's wonderful news. I'll let the doctor know right away. He'll want to discuss the next steps with you." As the nurse left to fetch the doctor, the room was filled with a new sense of hope. Julia looked between her father and her aunt, her face brighter than it had been in days. For the first time since this ordeal began, it felt like they had taken a significant step forward, a small light breaking through the darkness that had surrounded them for so long. "May I?" Jonathan moved to embrace Lisa. Lisa stood and nodded. "Thank you. So much." "You're welcome, Jonathan. You know how Karen is. You and Julia weren't the only ones affected by her," Lisa said as they parted. She looked at both of them, her expression serious. "The last time I saw her, and the reason I stopped going to her house, wasn't just a simple sibling fight. She blackmailed me after you two divorced. She took a photo of me with an old college friend I met at the bar and threatened to send it to my husband. My husband and I weren't on the best terms back then. Karen demanded money in exchange for the photo, but even after I gave her what she wanted, she still sent it to my husband. That's how things ended up in court, and my husband left me." "I'm so sorry, Aunt Lisa. I didn't know back then that you and Mum were—" Julia began, her voice filled with regret. "No, darling, it's not your fault, and it's not your problem to deal with," Lisa interrupted, clearing her throat. "Anyway, the point is, she's been using everyone just to get what she wants. I don't think I can deal with her. She called me this morning, told me she's on probation, but I don't think I can care anymore." Jonathan couldn't hold back the question that had been on his mind since Lisa arrived. Now that you mention it, Lisa, did you see Karen before you came here? Lisa's expression shifted, a mixture of disappointment and anger flashing across her face. I did, she replied. I went to her house after convincing myself 1,000 times to give her another chance, to see if she'd really changed, but she wasn't there. The door was open, Jonathan. I think she's gone. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, a wave of frustration washing over him. He had hoped, for Julia's sake, that Karen would follow through on her promise to help, but deep down, he wasn't surprised by her disappearance. When he opened his eyes, he saw tears streaming down Julia's face. She forced a smile, trying her best to hold it together. I knew it. I thought she could change when she wrote the letter. Her tears finally broke free, spilling over like a dam that had burst. She collapsed into Lisa's arms, and Lisa immediately pulled her into a tight embrace. It's okay to cry, Julia, go on, Lisa whispered, gently brushing her hair back. For a while, the room was filled with nothing but the sound of sobs, the raw emotion filling the space as Julia let her tears flow freely. As Julia finally allowed herself to release the weight of her emotions, the tension in her shoulders eased. Jonathan watched quietly, his heart heavy yet hopeful. When the sobs began to subside, he spoke, his voice steady. Julia, now with Lisa's help as a donor, we have a real chance. He pointed at the window, and they saw the doctor and nurse were just outside the room. The doctor says we can start the donor testing process right away. Would you like Aunt Lisa to be tested now? Julia nodded eagerly, her earlier sadness seemingly forgotten in the face of this new hope. Yes, please, she said, looking between her father and aunt with bright eyes. Jonathan nodded, opening the door for the doctor and nurse to walk in. As they watched them come, he exchanged a look with Lisa, silently communicating their shared concern about the procedures. But for now, they both pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on the possibility of hope that lay before them. The doctor, with the file tucked under his arm and a cautiously optimistic expression on his face, explained the procedure to Lisa and Julia. Ms. Blake, he began, addressing Lisa, I understand you've volunteered to be tested as a potential donor for Julia. That's incredibly generous of you. Lisa nodded, her face serious. Of course, I'd do anything for my niece. The doctor smiled, then turned to address the whole family. I'd like to explain the process we'll be following, he said. We'll start with a series of tests to determine compatibility. This includes blood type compatibility and cross-match testing. He paused, making sure they were following along before continuing. We'll take blood samples from both Julia and Lisa to determine their genetic markers on white blood cells. These markers regulate immune response, which is crucial for transplant success. Julia listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tried to understand the complex medical terminology. The doctor noticed her expression and smiled reassuringly. Don't worry if this all sounds complicated, Julia. The important thing to know is that because you and your aunt are family members, there's a higher chance of a good match. The better the match, the lower the risk of complications after the transplant. Julia nodded, a small smile of understanding crossing her face. Now, the doctor continued, if the initial tests show a promising match, we'll move forward with more detailed testing. But if they don't, we won't proceed with the transplant. We want to ensure the best possible outcome for Julia. Jonathan, who had been listening intently, spoke up. How long will it take to know if Lisa is a match? The doctor considered for a moment. The initial results should be available in a few hours. If those look good, we'll need to do more comprehensive testing. Julia's face fell slightly at this news, but Lisa quickly reached out to squeeze her hand. Don't worry, sweetie. I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this together, no matter how long it takes. The doctor nodded approvingly. That's the right attitude. Now, if you're ready, Lisa, we can start with the blood draw right away. Lisa agreed, and a nurse was called to take her to another room for the procedure. As Lisa was led away, she turned back to give Julia an encouraging smile and a thumbs up. Once Lisa had left, the doctor turned to Jonathan. Mr. Carter, while we're waiting for the results, I'd like to discuss the next steps in Julia's treatment plan. Could we speak privately for a moment? Jonathan nodded, then turned to Julia. Will you be okay here for a few minutes, sweetheart? I won't be far. Julia nodded bravely. I'll be fine, Dad. I think I'll try to nap a little. Jonathan leaned down to kiss her forehead before following the doctor out of the room. In the hallway, the doctor's expression grew serious. Mr. Carter, he began, I wanted to discuss the financial aspects of Julia's treatment. As I mentioned before, this is an expensive procedure. Jonathan nodded, his stomach clenching with anxiety. I understand. What do we need to do? The doctor pulled out some paperwork from his file. We'll need an initial deposit to begin the treatment process. The amount is $200,000. Jonathan felt his heart sink. Even with his recent efforts to secure funds, this was a staggering amount. But looking back at Julia through the room's window, he knew he had to find a way. I understand, he said, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. I'll make arrangements immediately. The doctor nodded, handing Jonathan the paperwork. Once you're ready, please bring this to the administration desk. They'll guide you through the rest of the process. As the doctor walked away, Jonathan leaned against the wall, closing his eyes briefly. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but he refused to let it crush him. Julia needed him to be strong. Several hours passed, filled with tense waiting and hushed conversations. Jonathan spent most of this time by Julia's bedside, alternating between working on his tablet and simply watching his daughter sleep. Lisa returned from her tests, looking tired but hopeful. As the afternoon wore on, Julia stirred from her nap. She blinked sleepily, her eyes focusing on her father and aunt sitting nearby. Any news? She asked, her voice still thick with sleep. Before either of them could answer, there was a knock at the door. The doctor entered, a file in his hands and a smile on his face. I have good news, he announced, his voice warm with optimism. The initial tests show that Lisa is a potential match for Julia. The room seemed to collectively exhale. Jonathan felt a weight lift from his shoulders, while Lisa's eyes filled with happy tears. Julia's face broke into a wide smile, the first genuine one Jonathan had seen in days. Really? Julia asked, her voice filled with hope. Aunt Lisa can be my donor. The doctor nodded, his smile widening. The preliminary results are very promising. We'll need to do some more comprehensive testing to be absolutely sure, but this is a very good start. Lisa moved to Julia's bedside, taking her niece's hand. See? I told you we'd get through this together. Jonathan stood, shaking the doctor's hand. Thank you, doctor. When can we schedule the additional tests? We can start right away, the doctor replied. I'd like to begin the more detailed testing as soon as possible. If all goes well, we could potentially schedule the transplant within the next few days. As the doctor explained the next steps, Jonathan felt a mix of relief and anxiety. They had cleared one hurdle, but there were still many ahead. He glanced at Julia, seeing the hope shining in her eyes, and knew he had to do everything in his power to make this work. Once the doctor left, promising to return with more details, the small family allowed themselves a moment of celebration. Julia's smile seemed to light up the room, and even Jonathan felt some of the tension of the past few days begin to ease. As the excitement settled, Jonathan remembered the paperwork in his pocket. I need to take care of some administrative details, he said, trying to keep his voice light. I'll be back soon. He stepped out into the hallway, making his way out of the hospital, and drove to his bank. As a priority member, he was quickly ushered into a private office where a financial advisor greeted him. Mr. Carter, how can we assist you today? The advisor asked. Jonathan took a deep breath. I need to discuss a loan. My daughter requires an urgent medical procedure, and I need to access funds immediately. The advisor nodded sympathetically. I understand, sir. Let's look at your options. For the next hour, Jonathan and the advisor pored over his finances. They discussed using his last savings as collateral for a substantial loan. Given his priority status and the urgency of the situation, the bank expedited the process. We can approve this loan immediately, Mr. Carter, the advisor finally said. The funds will be available for transfer right away. Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This means more than you know." With the loan secured, Jonathan walked out of the bank, a small weight lifting from his chest, though the road ahead still felt uncertain. As he made his way toward his car, his gaze caught sight of a nearby salon with rows of wigs displayed in the window, each one seemingly more vibrant than the last. On impulse, he stepped inside. The warm, soft hum of the salon contrasted sharply with the tension in his mind. After scanning the rows of options, he chose a wig that seemed perfect, one he imagined Julia would feel confident in, with its rich, natural color and subtle waves. It was a small gesture, but in that moment, it felt like something he could control. He made his way back to the car, the wig carefully secured in the passenger seat beside him. The drive back to the hospital was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the swirl of his thoughts. Once he arrived at the hospital, Jonathan maneuvered through the familiar corridors to the administration desk. He presented the paperwork the doctor had given him earlier, his hands steady despite the heaviness in his chest. "I'm here to make the initial deposit for my daughter's treatment," he said, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. The woman nodded, taking the paperwork and entering information into her computer. "The initial deposit required is $200,000, Mr. Carter. How would you like to proceed with the payment?" Jonathan pulled out his phone, accessing his banking app. "I'll be transferring the funds now," he said, completing the transaction. As he received the receipt, Jonathan felt the weight of the financial burden he'd just taken on. But looking back towards Julia's room, he felt a renewed sense of determination. No amount of money was too much when it came to saving his daughter's life. When he returned to the room, Julia and Lisa were chatting animatedly, the atmosphere noticeably lighter than it had been in days. Jonathan couldn't help but smile at the sight. "I have a surprise for you," he said, presenting the package to Julia. Julia's eyes widened as she carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a beautiful wig that matched her natural hair color perfectly. "Oh, Dad," she breathed, her eyes filling with tears. "It's beautiful." "Why don't you try it on?" Jonathan suggested gently. With Lisa's help, Julia removed her old wig and put on the new one. The transformation was remarkable. Julia looked at her reflection in the small mirror Lisa held up, a genuine smile spreading across her face. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. As Julia admired her reflection, a nurse entered the room. "We're ready to prep Julia for some pre-surgery tests," she announced. Jonathan nodded, helping Julia remove the new wig and place it carefully on the bedside table. "You can wear it again when you're out of surgery," he promised. "It'll give you something to look forward to." The doctor and nurse came back to their room and began explaining the upcoming procedures. Jonathan felt a wave of hope rise within him. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in a while the future felt promising. He watched as Julia absorbed every word of the nurse's instructions, her face firm with determination. "Are you ready to get started, sweetie?" asked the nurse, her voice soft and comforting, as she turned to Julia with a gentle smile after explaining the pre-surgery procedures. Julia nodded, a mixture of nervousness and determination crossing her face. She glanced at her father and aunt, searching for reassurance. "I think so. Yes." The nurse turned to Lisa, her tone professional yet warm. "And how about you, Ms. Lisa? Are you ready to proceed with the procedure?" Lisa took a deep breath, her expression steady but warm. "Yes," she replied softly, nodding. "I'm ready." Jonathan stepped forward, placing a kiss on Julia's forehead. "You've got this, sweetheart. I'll be right here waiting for you when you're done." Lisa squeezed Julia's hand. "Your dad's right. You're the bravest girl I know. I'll see you soon, okay?" Julia took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, I'm ready." The nurse helped Julia into a wheelchair, carefully arranging her IV lines. As they prepared to leave the room, Julia suddenly reached out for her new wig. "Can I take it with me?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful, "just to have it close by." The nurse smiled warmly. "Of course you can, dear. We'll keep it safe for you." Jonathan handed the wig to Julia, who hugged it close to her chest, the soft fabric offering her a sense of comfort, like a security blanket. With one last brave smile at her father, Julia nodded, her face a mixture of resolve and vulnerability. She allowed the nurse to wheel her out of the room, Lisa walking closely beside her, offering a steady presence as they left. Jonathan stood there watching them go, his heart heavy but hopeful. Jonathan stepped out into the hallway. He watched them disappear around a corner, then leaned against the wall, letting out a long breath. For the first time in what felt like ages, Jonathan allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. The weight of the financial burden he'd taken on was still there, but it felt lighter now, balanced by the possibility of Julia's recovery. He thought about the events of the past few days, the custody hearing, Julia's collapse, the diagnosis, and now this unexpected support from Lisa. It had been a whirlwind of emotions, but standing here now, Jonathan felt a sense of peace settling over him. A passing nurse offered him a sympathetic smile. "Would you like some coffee while you wait, sir? The cafeteria is just down the hall." Jonathan shook his head, returning the smile. "No, thank you. I think I'll just stay here." As the nurse moved on, Jonathan's gaze returned to the direction where Julia had gone. He could almost picture her now, sitting bravely as the doctors ran their tests, perhaps clutching her new wig for comfort, with Lisa by her side offering encouragement. The corridor was quiet, save for the distant sounds of hospital activity. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to imagine a future beyond this hospital. Julia, healthy and strong, her hair grown back, laughing as they played in the backyard of their home. Lisa would be there too, he decided, a part of their lives now. In that moment, Jonathan knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As a family, they had found their way back to each other, and together, they would fight for Julia's future.